The little girl grabbed the Millionaire Cowboy's sleeve just as he was about to speak, and what she whispered made the blood drain from his face. "Don't talk, he's there." Her tiny fingers trembled as she pointed toward the dusty window of the old ranch house. Outside, the evening wind moved through the dry grass of rural Texas, carrying the smell of rain that had not yet arrived. The cowboy, Nathaniel Carter, was a man who had faced wild horses, angry cattle, and dangerous men without ever showing fear. But the terror in 8-year-old Clara Bennett's eyes was different. It was the kind of fear that came from knowing something no child should ever have to know. Nathaniel slowly turned his head toward the window, but Clara pulled his arm back and shook her head. "Please," she whispered, "if he knows you heard me, Mommy will be hurt." At that moment, Nathaniel understood that this was not a simple warning. Somewhere inside that poor ranch house, a secret was waiting, and whatever it was had already frightened a child into silence. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can give people a second chance, and that one good person can change another person's life, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this to you. Nathaniel Carter was known across 3 counties as the wealthiest cowboy in the region. He owned thousands of acres outside Amarillo, a successful cattle operation, several ranch houses, and enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Yet wealth had never made him happy. 5 years earlier, his wife, Rebecca, had died after a long illness, leaving him with an emptiness he never talked about. Since then, Nathaniel had buried himself in work. Every morning before sunrise, he rode across his property, checking fences and cattle, and every evening he returned to a huge house that felt colder than the winter wind. He had everything except the one thing money could never purchase, a family that felt like home. On a cold November afternoon, Nathaniel drove his old pickup toward a remote section of his property where an abandoned cabin stood near the edge of a neighboring ranch. A violent storm the previous night had damaged one of his fences, and he had gone there to inspect the area. That was when he noticed a woman and a little girl walking along the dirt road. The woman carried a small canvas bag, while the girl wore a faded blue coat that was far too thin for the weather. Nathaniel stopped his truck and asked if they needed help. The woman introduced herself as Sarah Bennett, a widow who had recently moved into the old ranch house with her daughter Clara. Sarah explained that her husband had died 2 years earlier and that she was trying to survive by cleaning houses and doing odd jobs around the county. She apologized for being on his land, saying she had become confused about the property boundaries. Nathaniel noticed how exhausted she looked. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, and her hands were red from working outside in the cold. Clara stood close to her mother, watching Nathaniel carefully. He offered them a ride, but Sarah politely refused. Nathaniel respected her pride, but something about the little girl stayed with him. Before leaving, he gave Sarah his card and told her that if she ever needed firewood, food, or work, she should call him. He expected nothing in return. 3 days later, Sarah appeared at his ranch office. She did not ask for money. Instead, she asked if Nathaniel needed someone to help clean the guest cabins. He hired her immediately. Over the next several weeks, Sarah worked harder than anyone Nathaniel had ever employed. Clara sometimes waited outside the office after school, quietly drawing pictures in an old notebook. Nathaniel began noticing that the drawings almost always showed 3 people standing beside a house. One was Clara. One was her mother. The third was always drawn without a face. Nathaniel asked her once who the third person was, but Clara quickly closed the notebook and said it was nobody. He did not push her. Then strange things began happening. Sarah would suddenly become nervous whenever a truck drove slowly past the ranch. Clara refused to go near the windows after sunset. Once, Nathaniel found her hiding behind a stack of feed bags. When he asked what had frightened her, she simply said she had heard someone outside. Sarah insisted that everything was fine, but Nathaniel could see she was lying. One evening, Nathaniel arrived at the Bennett house to deliver groceries. The porch light was broken, and the front door was slightly open. He knocked several times before entering. Sarah was nowhere in sight. Clara was sitting on the kitchen floor, clutching a stuffed rabbit. The moment she saw Nathaniel, she ran toward him. That was when she grabbed his sleeve and whispered the words that changed everything. "Don't talk, he's there." Nathaniel froze. He looked toward the hallway, but Clara pulled him down and pointed toward the window. Outside, beneath the shadow of an old oak tree, stood a man. He was watching the house. Nathaniel recognized him immediately. His name was Marcus Reed, a former ranch hand who had worked for Nathaniel years earlier. Marcus had been fired after Nathaniel discovered that he was stealing livestock and threatening workers who tried to stop him. Nathaniel had not seen him in years, but Clara knew him. She whispered that Marcus had been following her mother for months. He had threatened Sarah because he wanted documents that belonged to her late husband. Clara did not know exactly what was in the documents, only that her father had once told her mother to keep them safe because they could expose someone powerful. Nathaniel felt a chill run through him. He quietly moved Clara into another room and called the authorities. But before help arrived, Marcus disappeared into the darkness. Sarah returned 20 minutes later carrying a bag of medicine. When she saw Nathaniel and Clara together, she immediately understood that the secret was out. She broke down. For months, Sarah had been hiding the truth because she was terrified that Marcus would hurt Clara. Her late husband, Thomas Bennett, had worked as an accountant for a cattle company owned by a wealthy businessman named Harold Whitmore. Before Thomas died, he discovered that Harold and several partners had been falsifying land records and stealing money from local ranchers. Thomas had copied the evidence onto a small storage device and hidden it with Sarah. Marcus had once worked for Harold. After Thomas died, Marcus began threatening Sarah, demanding the evidence. Sarah had moved from town to town, hoping he would eventually stop searching for them. But he had found them again. Nathaniel listened in silence. Then Sarah revealed something even more shocking. Thomas had not simply discovered corruption. He had discovered that Nathaniel Carter's own ranch was connected to the scheme. Someone had been secretly attempting to steal sections of Nathaniel's land through forged documents. If the plan succeeded, Nathaniel could have lost thousands of acres without even knowing who had done it. Nathaniel felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath his boots. For years, he had believed his biggest enemies were business competitors and difficult cattlemen. He had never imagined that someone had been quietly attacking his property from inside the legal system. Sarah handed him the storage device. Nathaniel looked at it, but did not take it immediately. He looked at Clara instead. The little girl was standing beside her mother, still holding the stuffed rabbit. She had spent months living in fear because adults had created a world where telling the truth felt more dangerous than hiding it. Nathaniel finally reached for the device. But instead of thinking about money, land, or business, he thought about Rebecca. His late wife had always told him that wealth was meaningless if it could not be used to protect people who had no power to protect themselves. That night, Nathaniel made a decision. He would not simply hand the evidence over and walk away. He would protect Sarah and Clara until the truth was fully exposed. The investigation that followed shocked the entire county. Authorities uncovered forged documents, illegal transfers, stolen cattle records, and financial evidence connecting Marcus and Harold to a much larger operation. Several people who had remained silent for years finally came forward. Nathaniel's land was secured, and the people responsible were arrested. But the greatest change happened inside the Bennett home. Sarah no longer had to look over her shoulder every time a truck passed the house. Clara stopped hiding behind doors. And Nathaniel, who had spent years living alone inside a mansion, began visiting the little ranch house almost every evening. At first, he brought groceries. Then he brought books. Then he brought a small wooden rocking horse for Clara. Eventually, he realized he was no longer visiting because he felt sorry for them. He was visiting because he had become part of their lives. One spring morning, Clara stood beside Nathaniel while he repaired a fence. She looked at him and asked if he was ever going to leave again. Nathaniel smiled and told her that some places were worth coming back to. Clara smiled too. Then she asked him something that made him stop working. She asked whether he thought her father would have liked him. Nathaniel looked across the open Texas fields, swallowed hard, and said that he hoped he would have. Clara nodded, as though she already knew the answer. Months later, Nathaniel did something no one in town expected. He sold one of his distant ranch properties and used the money to establish a small foundation helping widows and children who had been forced into poverty after losing a spouse. Sarah became part of the organization, helping other families find work and temporary housing. Nathaniel never called it charity. He called it giving people the chance he wished someone had given him after Rebecca died. And Clara became the heart of the entire project. She grew older, stronger, and more confident. The little girl who once whispered, "Don't talk, he's there," eventually became the girl who stood in front of rooms full of people and spoke without fear. Years later, when someone asked Nathaniel what had changed his life, he never mentioned the millions of dollars he had made, the land he owned, or the cattle he had raised. He always told them about a frightened little girl standing in a dark kitchen. He told them about a widow who refused to surrender her dignity even when life had taken almost everything from her. And he told them that sometimes the greatest fortune a person can discover is not hidden in a bank account or buried beneath the ground. Sometimes it is hidden inside a scared child who only needs one adult brave enough to listen. Nathaniel had once believed that being a strong man meant never showing fear, never asking for help, and never letting anyone see his wounds. Clara taught him something different. Real strength was protecting someone weaker when you had nothing to gain. Real courage was speaking for those who were afraid. And sometimes, the second chance you give another person becomes the second chance you secretly needed yourself. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe to the channel. You never know whose life might be changed by a simple story about courage, compassion, and second chances. And before we reach the final moment, I want you to leave one special comment. Kindness can change a life. Write those words if you believe that helping someone in their darkest moment can create a light they carry for the rest of their lives. As the sun disappeared behind the Texas horizon one peaceful evening, Clara stood on the porch with Sarah while Nathaniel prepared to leave. She watched him climb into his truck, then ran down the steps and hugged him tightly. Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment, holding her as if she were his own daughter. There was no fear in Clara anymore. No trembling hands. No frightened whispers. Only a smile. Nathaniel looked toward the wide Texas sky and realized that the greatest thing he had ever owned was not the ranch, the cattle, or the fortune built over decades. It was the trust of a child who had once been too afraid to speak. And somewhere inside that quiet moment, Nathaniel finally understood the shocking truth Clara had unknowingly taught him that night. Sometimes, the person who saves you is the person you thought you were saving.